My uncle spent most of his life at sea. I can't go into too much detail, but he was a specialist technician of some sort. He spent about 70% of the year on business trips, mostly to Northern Europe. And when he returned to Japan, he'd always make time for me. Now he's retired, happily married, and full of energy. He's a deeply knowledgeable man, and this is the most terrifying story he ever told me. Back then, my uncle was in his 30s, living in an apartment with his girlfriend. They were happy. One day, they struck up a friendship with their neighbors, an elderly couple who had a very sick son. The husband in that family also flew abroad frequently for work, so he and my uncle quickly found common ground. The neighbor's wife was a gentle, pleasant woman. Eventually, the couple started hosting each other for dinner. One deep winter, during a lively dinner party, the topic turned to their country house. It turned out the neighbors owned a villa in a remote, quiet mountain area near Kanto. There was a stream nearby for fishing, and they visited once a year to let their son breathe the mountain air. However, that year, work was too busy and they couldn't go. They made an offer. If you'd like, you can stay there. My uncle, a lover of the outdoors, jumped at the chance. His girlfriend, Akimi, loved the idea too. So at the start of the year, they headed out to the villa. The house was a 40-minute drive up a crumbling mountain road. As soon as they saw it, Akemi let out a heavy sigh, and not one of wonder. Honestly, it was a shack, my uncle recalled with a wry smile. Based on the neighbors' stories, we were expecting a stylish chalet. The reality was a pathetic, one-story wooden box. The entryway was tiny. The kitchen was the size of a cat's forehead, and the closets were full of dusty futons. The only saving grace was the living room. It had a fireplace and was actually quite spacious. Since they were already there, they decided to make the best of it. They spent their days fishing in the creek and gathering wild herbs in the forest. In the evenings, they made tempura and enjoyed the peace. One day, while gathering herbs, I wandered deep into the woods until the house was barely visible. That's when I saw it. An oak tree. Specifically, a kunugi, a Japanese chestnut oak. It looked completely out of place. The surrounding trees were different. It was obvious this oak had been planted there intentionally and recently. It was thick with mistletoe. Now, kunugi grows fast, but what chilled me were the markings carved into the trunk. Ogum script. Ogum was used by ancient druids for rituals. It consists of vertical and slanted lines etched across a central horizontal axis. To the untrained eye, it doesn't even look like letters. Seeing it in the middle of a Japanese forest was deeply unsettling for my uncle, who knew a fair bit about the occult. That night, the horror began. My uncle was doing a sweep of the house, checking the locks. "How did I miss it?" he said. The locks were on the outside. Aside from the usual internal latches, the windows and the front door were fitted with external sliding bolts. That's when I realized we were in trouble. I looked around and noticed how little furniture there was, just the bare minimum, and everything was made of thin, highly flammable wood. One phrase flashed through my mind: the Wicker Man. Most horror fans know the reference. The ancient druid rite where people were burned alive inside a giant effigy. I didn't tell Akimi about the locks. I didn't want to panic her. I just told her I'd keep watch and unlocked all the internal latches. Then, in the dead of night, he heard the crunch of gravel and felt a presence outside. My uncle threw the window open. Standing there, caught off guard, was the neighbor, the husband. "What are you doing here?" my uncle demanded. The man was stunned, stammering. I just came to check if everything was okay." "Nothing is okay." "What's that canister in your hand? Is that kerosene?" "No, I just thought, in case you ran out of fuel for the heater." "We have a fireplace," my uncle snapped. He began interrogating the man about the external locks. The neighbor claimed they were there when he bought the place. Who would believe that? Who lives in a house that locks from the outside? My uncle didn't buy a word of it. Akemi woke up from the noise and peered out, trembling. Sato-san, my uncle said to the neighbor. You're practicing druid rituals, aren't you? I don't know what you're talking about, the man pleaded. Stop lying. That oak tree in the woods? It's going to make excellent firewood. What? No, you can't. Were you going to turn us into wicker men? Were you going to sacrifice us? The neighbor went silent. When my uncle threatened to go out and chop down the oak tree right then and there, the man broke down and confessed. As I mentioned, they had a very sick son. Medical treatment only slowed the disease while causing horrific side effects. They were desperate. 15 years ago, during a business trip to Wales, Sato-san met a druid sorcerer. For a massive sum of money, he bought an oak sapling supposedly imbued with magical power and brought it to Japan. He was taught a ritual. On the 6th day of every month, he had to wear white robes, climb the tree, and cut the mistletoe with a special golden sickle. Then, he had to offer a sacrifice to the tree in exchange for his son's health. And indeed, that night was January 6th, my uncle muttered. What kind of sacrifices? I asked, my voice small. At first, small animals. Hamsters, stray cats, dogs. He buried them at the roots. He convinced himself that the larger the animal, the better his son felt. The sorcerer had clearly played him for a fool, but no matter how blind a parent's love is, trying to burn us alive was across the line. My uncle spent the next hour convincing the man to stop, telling him the old proverb, when you set out on a journey of revenge, or a curse, dig 2 graves. He used his knowledge of the occult to explain that these rites would only bring ruin. The man, nearly 50 years old, was wailing. Even though he almost killed us, it was hard not to feel pity. Akemi was crying too. Eventually, he promised to sell the house and cut down the tree. We agreed that the next morning we would watch him destroy it. So it ended without the police? I asked. I wish. It turned out that oak tree was real. Once the tension had simmered down, the 3 of them sat drinking coffee. Suddenly, the neighbor's phone rang. It was his wife calling from Tokyo. Her voice was so shrill my uncle could hear it from across the table. It was a hysterical shriek.
Did you kill them? Did you offer the sacrifice? Is it done?
A chill ran down my uncle's spine. The gentlewoman was actually the mastermind. The neighbor tried to argue, but she drowned him out with her screams. Finally, my uncle grabbed the phone. A fierce shouting match ensued, one side defending their lives, the other demanding blood. Even Akemi started screaming into the phone. In that moment I thought, man, if we survive this, she's going to be the boss of me, my uncle chuckled. And indeed, my aunt definitely wears the pants in the house now. When my uncle threatened the police and a lawsuit, the wife finally went silent and reluctantly agreed to stop. The conflict seemed over. But since it was the middle of the night, they decided to wait until morning. None of us slept. Who could? My uncle and Akemi sat huddled by the fireplace while the neighbor sat guiltily in the corner. They were waiting for dawn and the workers who would fell the tree. It was about 3 a.m. Footsteps came from the forest. A wild animal? A stray dog? My uncle, who had been nodding off, bolted upright. When I realized they were human footsteps, the hair on my neck stood up. At first, he thought the wife had somehow driven from Tokyo, but it was impossible in that time frame. Unless she had been hiding in the bushes all along. Or they had accomplices. Ignoring the cold, my uncle threw open the windows and doors to ensure an escape route. He grabbed his camping knife and waited. The footsteps were steady, confident, walking straight toward the shack. After 10 minutes, it reached the door like an ordinary guest. Yoko! The neighbor cried out, recognizing his wife's name. but his joy turned into a scream of pure horror. It was her, and yet it wasn't. The face was identical to his wife's, but it was completely lifeless. And she was standing there, stark naked in the freezing cold. At first I thought the neighbor screamed because of her nudity, but it was the skin, the texture. It was wood, natural timber, and worst of all, her arms and legs were attached backward. Her left leg was where the right should be, and vice versa. She tried to step inside, but because of her twisted limbs, she kept stumbling over the threshold. It was unbearable to look at. Akemi and the neighbor were screaming. It was clear this wasn't human, but it looked like a person. My brain kept hitting a safety switch. The thought, what if it is her? The thing entered the room and began to make a sound. It wasn't speech. It was a low hum, like the buzzing of a beetle's wings. Swaying on its inverted legs, the creature lunged at my uncle. I actually asked, "Are you Sato Yoko-san?" That damn safety switch in my head. But the thing just buzzed louder and reached out with wooden hands to crush my throat. That's when I kicked it in the stomach with everything I had. Its belly just shattered. A thick fluid like tree sap sprayed everywhere. The inside was hollow. That was it. I decided, if it's not human, I can destroy it. My uncle laughed in that booming way of his. In moments like this, you realize how brave he actually is. The creature tried to stand. My uncle drove his knife directly into the top of its head, and when he kicked it again, the rotting wooden torso snapped in half. The screams from Akemi and the neighbor grew even louder. Foul-smelling dirt poured out of its stomach, along with centipedes and beetles. The room was chaos. The figure on the floor began to decompose rapidly into a pile of mulch. I scooped it all up and shoveled it into the fireplace. I only realized later that the knife I'd stabbed into its head had vanished. After the struggle, my uncle forced the neighbor to call his wife again. She picked up immediately. I was afraid that if this was a double, she might have died when I destroyed it. No, she was alive and just confused as to why he was calling again. The neighbor didn't tell her what happened, at least not while we were there. When the adrenaline faded, I started shaking. Akemi was sobbing. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She asked, "Why did you call it Sato-san?" My uncle was confused. "What do you mean?" "It had his wife's face." "And?" I asked, leaning in. My uncle's face darkened. Akemi said, "How could you be so cold-blooded? How could you drive a knife into the head of someone who looked exactly like you?" In Akemi's eyes, the monster had taken my uncle's form. My uncle believes that because of the rituals, a malicious consciousness had inhabited the tree. It fed on the hatred and fanaticism of the neighbor's wife, and when the supply of sacrifices stopped, it manifested itself. It showed each person what they feared most, or the person most connected to the terror of the moment. The next morning, we waited for the sun to reach its peak and went to the tree. There was a dent in the trunk, about 2 centimeters deep, in the shape of a human figure roughly 160 centimeters tall. And right where the head should be, my knife was buried in the wood. The loggers arrived that evening. When the saw bit into the trunk, and again when the tree finally fell, my uncle Akemi and the neighbor all heard a woman's deathly shriek. The workers heard nothing. When they dug up the stumps, piles of small animal bones spilled out of the earth. The workers almost ran away themselves when they saw the bones and the silhouette on the tree. Luckily, no human remains were found. Later, the neighbors brought gifts as an apology. I threw them away immediately, my uncle admitted. You never know what might be attached to them. Soon after, the couple moved away, and my uncle and Akemi changed apartments too. They broke up for a while due to the stress, but eventually they found their way back to each other and got married. Yes, that did happen, Aunt Akemi said nostalgically, pouring more tea. By the way, my uncle looked at a tree in their garden. We have a kashiwa, Japanese emperor oak, growing here. We planted it for luck when we built the house. You know, any object is just a tool. It all depends on the heart. If you point it toward the light or the dark, that becomes your reality. That was the end of his story. I promised to visit them again for the holidays to eat kashiwa mochi, rice cakes wrapped in oak leaves, and left their cozy home.